So you've just started in your development career, you've written a bunch of portfolio projects, and now you're about to land your first job, but everybody starts their career as a junior developer, and you want to make your way from a junior to a mid-level to a senior to a lead developer, etc., and you want to progress. And in this video, I'm going to tell you the fastest way to get your skills up and the kind of role that you should be looking for as your first gig to progress from a junior to a senior developer in the least amount of time. Okay, so how do you gain 5 years of experience in 2 years? Now, if you know anything about me, you know that I'm a freelance developer. I have only ever been a freelance developer, and being a freelance developer means that I work on a bunch of different projects. You know, I might work on 2 or 3 or 4 projects a year. Some of them are big scale, some of them are small scale. Almost all of them involve working on a team with other developers, whether that be developers on other platforms. So I'm Android and someone else is doing iOS, or that be working with developers and there might be a team of 6 Android developers that I'm a part of and another team of iOS developers and backend and so on and so forth. And I was on a podcast recently and I was asked, what do I think about experience? And the conclusion that I came to in terms of getting experience is kind of seen as a measure of time. So the longer amount of time that you've been doing something, the more experienced you're expected to be. But you generally find that there are some developers who have been doing it for 5 years and are exceptional and are, you know, what you would expect a developer to look like after they've been doing it for 5 years. And then you also find developers who have been doing it for 5 years, but when you work with them on a project, you would think they've only been doing it for a year because their knowledge is super limited. They only know how to do a few things. They're not very fast at doing their work. And so experience as a measure of time is not a great way to measure a developer's skills. And I came to the conclusion that probably exposure is a better word. How do you get more exposure? The more exposure a developer has to different types of projects and technologies and all of this kind of thing is going to help them progress a lot further and gain that experience that they are expected to have, not as a measure of time, but as a measure of how much exposure they get to those things. And so in my mind, it is totally possible to get, 5 years experience with 2 years exposure. So how do you get exposure to all different projects and what kind of roles should you be looking at for your first job? Now, personally, as I said, I'm a huge advocate of freelancing and contracting because it gives you so much exposure. Across a 2-year period, you could end up working on 4 different projects, which could be 4 different apps or 4 different websites with 4 different companies, with 4 different teams who work in 4 different ways and who have 4 different architectures and use 4 different technologies to do the same thing. And so you've built this wide range of knowledge about all of these different things because you've worked on them, as opposed to working 2 years in exactly the same place, working on exactly the same project with exactly the same team members, and everything is the same. You've learned one thing and you know how to do it really, really well, but you learned how to do it really well after 3 months, and 2 years later, you're still doing the exact same thing. If you're not able to freelance or contract, or you're not feeling confident to do it, or you just don't want to do it, then I would highly advocate working for an agency. And by agency, I mean a company, preferably one that subcontracts you out to other gigs. So for example, there's lots of agencies that build everything in-house. So there'll be an app development agency. Someone will come to them and say, hey, can you build me this app? And they have a team of 6 developers that will build this app. And then another client will come to them and say, can you build me this app? And those same 6 developers will help them build that app. And while you gain exposure to different projects that way, you're still working with all the same people, which means probably each app is going to be architected in exactly the same way. It's going to use exactly the same libraries. And so how much you can learn on that job is going to be limited after a period of time. If you can get a job working at an agency that subcontracts you, which would be you work at this agency, a company comes to this agency and says, hey, can you give me 5 developers to help me work on this project? And it gives them 5 developers, and you go and you work on that project with that company, with all the things that come for working with that company without directly being hired by them. And then you go back to your agency and another client comes to your agency and says, hey, I need 2 developers to help me on this project. And so you go and integrate with that client's team, which means that you're working on a bunch of different projects, but you're also working with a bunch of different people because each of these companies have their own employees who are also working on that product. And you're working with a bunch of different architectures, and you're working with a bunch of different processes. You know, this company uses Jira, this company uses something else, this company does Agile and does sprints, and this company does something else. And so if you can work for an agency like that, then in a much, much shorter period of time, you'll gain a much wider range of exposure to all different sorts of things, which will then level up your skills. So in 2 years, your CV will look like you've been doing it for 5 years because you've worked on so many different things and had exposure to so much more. So if you're looking at getting your first job, or if you're just wondering, how can I get more, you know, quote unquote experience in a much shorter time period, then agencies, if you're not wanting to be freelance or contractor, are definitely the way to go. And the kind of agency that subcontracts you out is the preference. But again, if you end up working for an agency that, you know, it's all the same people, but they're working on all different apps, it's still exposure to different things, because each of those apps or those websites, whatever the technology is that you're building, will still have different elements to it. And by working on them, you get exposure. So again, for me, it's all about exposure. So you want to be thinking about how can you get the most exposure to the widest range of things. And that's how you'll be able to get the most experience in the least amount of time. And just a quick note before you go, if you like this video, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit the notification bell so you'll get notified every time a new episode comes out.